Okay, so I think we're good to go. So welcome everyone. I don't know, I can't see how many people have logged on yet, but I'm delighted to welcome everyone to the third in our 𝗃𝗁 webinar series. So we're here tonight on a topic that I'm particularly interested in, which is equine gastric ulcers, and I'm pleased to say we have an absolutely excellent panel here tonight. So I'd like first just to thank Connolly's Red Mills, who are our sponsors for tonight's webinars, because without our industry partners, we couldn't host these webinars. So thank you to Connolly's for that. So we have two excellent speakers tonight. I think any of the vets in the audience will not need to be introduced to Dr. Ben 𝗧𝗁, but I will do that anyway for the people that don't already know him. So Dr. 𝗧𝗁 is a vet with over 28 years experience of clinical work in equine practice, and he's boarded with the American College of Veterinary Internal Medicine in large animal internal medicine. He's worked with a wide range of horses, but has a particular interest in high performance horses, both thoroughbreds and sport horses. And in addition to this, he's also very interested in equine or in clinical research. And his research has focused on gastrointestinal disease in horses, and in particular with emphasis on equine gastric ulcer syndrome. Dr. 𝗧𝗁 is experienced both in postgraduate and undergraduate education and speaks at conferences worldwide. So we are very lucky to have him here tonight. And I know it's the crack of dawn in the morning for you over there, Ben, in Australia. He also consults for companies globally on the development and commercialization of products related to the equine market. And he is very highly regarded as a researcher. In 2023 and in 2024/25, he was recognized by Stanford University in the top 2% and 1% respectively of researchers in his field. So I think we can definitely say that Ben 𝗧𝗁 knows about equine gastric ulcer syndrome. There's nobody better to talk on this topic. I'm delighted to say we also have 𝗧𝗏 O'Connor here tonight as well. So I know 𝗧𝗏 now for the last few years, and she leads the technical support and education for the Connolly's international clients for Connolly's Red Mills and Foreign Healthcare. So like myself, 𝗧𝗏 is a UCD veterinary graduate, and she has a master's in pharmaceutical regulatory affairs. So before joining Connolly's, 𝗧𝗏 worked in a wide range of equine or practice, including equine practice, farm animals and small animals. So 𝗧𝗏's passion is emerging nutritional research, and she's committed to ensuring that Connolly's Red Mill stays up to date and continues to evolve alongside the latest technologies. She's very interested in equine nutrition and preventative measures. And as she deals with a lot of international clients, 𝗧𝗏 likes to explore the different living conditions of horses around the world and how their diets can be adapted to manage their various management systems. And both 𝗧𝗏 and Ben, as well as talking the talk, they walk the walk, they both compete horses. And Ben has a particular interest in thoroughbred aftercare because his wife manages a farm that specializes in taking horses off the track and preparing them for second careers. So he sees it from every angle, from both the rider and the veterinarian. So just a quick bit of housekeeping. We have a large audience, so if people could just put questions into the chat section under comments. And just to say, this is a different streaming platform to what we've had before. So for the vets that are in the audience that want to get their CPD points, if you please just put in a little comment with your name into the chat, then we'll make sure that you get those points sent out to you in the next week or two. So without further ado, I'm going to stop talking and let Ben and 𝗧𝗏 do the talking. I think, Ben, you're going to start with a little bit. We're going to keep it conversational, but we have a little slideshow, and you're going to talk about the science behind the wonderful thing that is the equine stomach and how and when it goes wrong.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invite, and thank you for everyone for making the time to come along this evening, your time, I guess. So yeah, so, I think it's really important. Any conversation we start on gastric ulcers, we have to define what we're talking about. And as with many things in the world, there's a lot of information out there, and there's a lot of conflation that goes on when we talk about gastric disease. And some of that represents an evolution over time of our understanding. Some of that represents the misuse of information for commercial purposes, let's say. This horse's stomach is a single chamber. The single chamber is about 10, 15 litres. So it's relatively small for their size, and they generate, between 50 and 70% of their energy actually comes from their hindgut. So we're not talking about hindgut today, but it's actually really important that we always keep that in mind, that that is actually the engine of the horse, and the stomach is what we top it up with. And so we top it up with carbohydrates and stuff to increase our energy capacity, but it's really the hindgut that's driving the horse's energy. So the stomach's set up to sort of start that process. The horse's stomach is not quite unique, but very unusual. It's horses, rhinoceroses, and rats have this type of stomach. Fun fact for the day, if you open a rhinoceros up inside gastrointestinally, it's almost identical to a horse, apparently. I've not had the pleasure, but I know surgeons that have, just much thicker skin to get there. Top half of the stomach's lined by the squamous mucosa. That squamous mucosa is like our skin and our esophagus. And in very, very simple terms, it's an area that's designed not to be exposed to acid. And what we see is, or not to be exposed to acid for extended periods of time. And what we see is when we have increased acid exposure, we get effectively a chemical burn. And so that is the cornerstone of squamous disease. And it's all about that acid exposure to the squamous mucosa. And so the things that drive that tend to be management orientated. And so I think of squamous disease as being 80% management and 20% horse. And we'll talk about the big factors: forage, carbohydrates, exercise, all relate to squamous disease. I say 20% horse because there is an individual horse susceptibility. Some horses tend to be more prone to getting ulcers than others. Some of that may be anatomical. We might see that lesser curvature in some horses. For the vets, that lesser curvature comes further under towards the pylorus where the acid's made. But it's also probably behavioral. When we're going to touch on the behavioral aspects of squamous disease and the behavioral aspects of eating. When we think about the bottom half of the stomach, it's the glandular mucosa, and it's really actually across on the right-hand side of that image there, that antrum pylorus. And it's really the antrum where the stomach empties into the small intestine, where we see glandular disease. Glandular disease is much more of a horse-centric disease. It's an individual horse's experience. It's still environmentally associated. It's a stress-based disease, but it's that individual horse's intersection with its environment that's really important. So we think about that in terms of how we manage that horse individually, as well as the environment around it to change the impact of that horse. We see breed predispositions in glandular disease. The warm blood dressage horse, both the breed and the discipline's kind of the poster child for glandular disease. We don't really see breed predisposition so much in squamous disease because it's much more the management that drives it. And if we impose that management on any horse, we can develop disease. It's more about the use of the horse that drives the disease.
Yeah, we could talk about the prevalence slide. I know we have the prevalence of squamous disease on a table as well, just to give people an idea of how it isn't specifically just a thoroughbred problem as we've outlined in our title.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, what's the prevalence of disease? Well, it's really reflective of the environment. For squamous disease, it's really reflective of the environment of the horse. So when we put horses and the exposure of those horses to what I think are the big three risk factors: inadequate or inappropriate forage, excessive carbohydrates, and their intersection with exercise. We take any horse and put those in those environments, we'll see squamous disease risk go up. Thoroughbred racehorses are kind of the poster children because they operate in low roughage, particularly traditionally, low roughage, high carbohydrate, and they exercise first thing in the morning on an empty stomach. And that's an important factor around their exercise. Standardbreds do the same, but their exercise is a bit different. So that might be why we see a little bit less in standardbreds. There might be a little bit more roughage. We've got to recognize a lot of these figures are old. A lot of this work hasn't been repeated, but also not a lot has necessarily changed because we haven't necessarily changed the drivers. And endurance horses, again, they are working high intensity, high duration exercise. And so for them, it's the exercise and to some degree the carbohydrates that drive their risk, even when they have roughage availability. So it's not just one factor, it's a constellation of factors. And it's the intersection, but we can have one factor that overrides everything. So if we have exercising first thing in the morning, all of the other factors can be done right, and that can be enough to drive disease. If we turn it on and look at glandular disease, and it's a whole different set of prevalences. Sorry, Andrea, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to ask a question that I know the prevalence for them is different. In terms of how your horse behaves, is there a difference, in how they behave, whether they have, squamous or glandular, or do they behave with the same, sort of pain signs or lack of performance or all those things, irrespective of which type they have?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in terms of the presentation of disease and the clinical signs that we see, or we would call them symptoms in humans, but clinical signs in horses or animals, traditionally, and when I say traditionally, we're going back 20, 25 years, when we first started understanding this, when we first started looking at horses' stomachs endoscopically, what we were looking at was the squamous mucosa. And we saw an association with, and predominantly in racehorse populations, because that was the original study, we saw fairly strong associations between squamous disease and changes in appetite, loss of appetite, unexplained weight loss. And that unexplained weight loss is probably primarily due to decreased roughage intake. And we still see that. We still see that as a presenting sign. So if I see a horse and it looks like a duck and it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's a thoroughbred racehorse on a high grain, low roughage diet, and it has a progressive low grade loss of appetite, then squamous disease is going to be very much the top of my list. We do not see that association with glandular disease. And in fact, glandular disease, it's a common misconception that my horse can't have ulcers because it's fat and shiny. Absolutely. That is the poster child for glandular disease. And in fact, we see glandular disease, we see no association with weight loss, no association with change in appetite. If anything, there may be more voracious eaters in one study. If I see glandular disease and weight loss, it makes me worry there's more complex disease like IBD. So that's the appetite angle. The behavior angle is what we now recognize is 85% of the horses presenting for gastroscopy, this is US data, but 85% of the horses presenting for gastroscopy are presenting with at least behavioral change or behavioral complaint as part of the primary presentation. We don't see a distinction between squamous and glandular disease there. We recognize that they both cause pain. They probably have different mechanisms, but the end result is the same. The horse's language of expression is the same. It's also the same as if it's got a sore leg, a sore back, or a sore tooth.
Okay. So the way I had a horse that used to get glandular ulcers more than squamous ones. And now that you say it, he was a big fat shiny horse, half bred, loved to eat, but used to absolutely try and take my hand off when I was tying his girth if his ulcers were at him, and then I'd scope him and I'd treat him and they'd all get better, and then it would happen again a few months later. So do the squamous ulcers have that same thing of, when you're tightening the girth that they'll react, or is that specific to glandular ulcers, or is that just the same? The pain kind of response is the same for both then, is it?
Yeah, so that's where we get into our pain language. And so we recognize that when we actually look at, it's fascinating. Horses are great communicators. We have been terrible listeners. And then I'll add a layer to that. As veterinarians, we've tended to be terrible listeners to our owners sometimes. And when we actually sit there and listen through what's being described, if you take and look at the ridden horse pain ethogram, a lot of that stuff has always been described by horse owners recognizing change in their horse. It's then the attribution of it, the listening to it as a meaningful thing, and then the attribution of it. We recognize things like girthiness, excessive pinning of ears, tail flicking, these types of things. These are non-specific pain-based behaviors. We see a lot of the ridden horse pain ethogram is changing head position. So it's beyond the vertical, behind the vertical, in front of the vertical, to the side, whatever, the head where it's not meant to be.
Yeah.
And these are forms of resistance. We see them as resistance. When we talk about it, traditional training, we see that the horse is being resistant. It's pushing back. Actually, the horse is trying to communicate to us that it is not happy with the situation. That can be training, but we recognize more and more that's pain. We see that with oral lesions. We see it. And then when we talk specifically about girthiness, it's often been attributed, the horse is reacting because I'm putting the saddle on. That is a painful event. And that might be true for things like back pain, but we also recognize that horses form complex anticipatory pain-based behavior. So horses that are lame with hind limb lameness have increased aversive behavior scores during tacking up. They have formed an association that they can form that association. It can be reactive or it can be anticipatory, that you put in that saddle on, they go, okay, it doesn't hurt now, but it's gonna hurt when you take me out and ride me in that arena. It can be very situational. It can be very learned type behavior.
Wow, that's interesting. Here she's coming with her saddle. I'm going to be in pain in 10 minutes.
It's complex with the girthiness thing as well. I know Lydia Gray and Nikki did a great webinar the last time on hindgut, and if you think about the anatomy of where the girth is tying, it's not where the stomach is at all, really. So like the girthiness thing shouldn't be automatically ulcers. So I think we have to think of it, take a step back and see how complex that is, and not just try to assign it to one specific thing. Because as you know, nothing is straightforward, is it?
Yeah, and
the more I learn, the more complicated it gets. Sorry, Ben.
I was going to say, you look at all the literature, and actually, you know, this disconnect between, we've got dozens, hundreds of studies looking at the horse's stomach. One study on girthiness that I know of from a veterinary perspective. And it was a UC Davis study, and the long version short was a third of the horses had ulcers, a third of the horses had musculoskeletal disease, and a third of the horses had other things.
Okay.
And so it really reinforces that is a non-specific pain-based behavior. It is not a clinical sign of any specific disease. And if you presented a horse to me with girthiness as a clinician, or I would make this comment in general, but the first thing I'm going to do is palpate that horse's back. Despite the fact my bread and butter is gastric ulcers, the first thing I'm going to do is palpate that horse's back and think about its saddle fit, because it's by far a more obvious reason why a horse might react to the saddle. Okay. But if you watch these horses closely, they'll be standing quietly in the cross ties, happy, watching the world go past, and you see them, and people walk up with a saddle and they see the saddle and put their ears back.
Right.
You know, not every horse, but they have learned that they go, oh no, this is going to hurt. And we need to be listening to that. That's, I think, that's been a huge change in the last 5 years, is our understanding of that and our openness to listening to that.
Well, that's the first myth busted just there now, because I certainly always kind of associated, you know, pain and pulling up the girth with stomach ulcers. So yeah, it's absolutely, it's really good.
Yeah, I think with the diagnosis of anywhere.
Sorry, Sorka, we lost you there. I just, before we move on to the next slide, and I know it's probably going to come up later, but a question has come in.
I think with the scopes being through easily, but there's a lot going on in the.
Okay, I think your connection isn't great there, Sorka. A question just has come in about the prevalence in leisure horses and sport horses versus thoroughbred. But so but you've kind of addressed that. It's the glandular is probably more prevalent in sport horses and the squamous in the race horses because of the specific diet. But other than that, it's not really the breed as such then, is it?
So squamous disease is not breed as such. I mean, we say ponies are less likely to get it, but when we talk about when we talk about the sort of the sports horse breeds, warm bloods, thoroughbreds, standardbreds, it's really more around those factors of usage and management. There is some variation. So it goes into the idea that eating's a behavior. So breeds that inherently are very good on the tooth don't tend to get much squamous disease as long as they have access. And so a horse like an Icelandic horse or a Finn horse, when I worked in Finland, these things would eat till they died. And
Connemara ponies here, Ben. Connemara ponies here, love to eat.
Connemara pony, as long as it's got roughage in front of it, it's probably going to have a fairly low risk of squamous disease, because it is going to eat that roughage and it's going to maintain that normal roughage ball. A warm blood, if you took a warm blood dressage horse and put it in a racehorse environment, it's going to get squamous ulcers. I almost guarantee it, because it's going to influence its behavior. It's one of the key drivers of thoroughbreds is a decreased voluntary intake in hay. We always talk about requiring 2% as fed body weight per day as the minimum of roughage. Thoroughbred racehorses voluntarily consume about 1%. It is a complex behavior, and they set it up. So that squamous is always going to be that intersection with management, but there is a horse level thing related to the behavioral aspect of disease. The glandular is much more complex than that, and we see glandular across a much broader base. In fact, it's interesting in our thoroughbred, the three we've got there, we don't have data on standardbred horses, that much data, but thoroughbred racehorses, glandular is below 50%. Endurance horses, it's below 50%. But in warm blood sport horses, it's above 50%, 60, 65%. So that is a much more breed discipline specific, an individual specific type disease.
Yeah. I like thoroughbreds. I mean, obviously I'm a big fan of thoroughbreds, or I wouldn't be involved with Trowella, but generally they're fairly even tempered, so they're probably a little bit different in temperament to warm bloods. So I guess that might make them a bit less predisposed to the glandular. They're not as stressy, I don't think.
It varies. We did a study where we looked at horses in Australia and the UK. In Australia, the population I work with, it's about 60%, 60 to 65%. The group in the UK, it was as low as 10%. And so we didn't ever really quite figured out. There were some factors we figured out the differences, but I think it was more complex than that. The reverse of that is thoroughbreds don't have to have ulcers. Now, when we take a thoroughbred out of training, and when we look at it in the retraining context, when we look at it in the riding horse context, there is nothing about the thoroughbred breed that says, I must have ulcers because I'm a thoroughbred. It goes back to those factors around management. And we have a string of competition horses, varies in number, let's say it's 8, depending on who's doing the maths. And I scoped those at the end of our competition season last year or the year before, and we travel every second or third weekend. We will travel 6 to 8 hours in each direction. So we put a lot of these stresses on these horses, and not a single one of our horses had squamous disease.
Right.
And this is a predominantly thoroughbred population. We've got 1 or 2 stock horses in there, but this is a predominantly thoroughbred population. So they don't have to have disease. It is that management that we impose on them, and it is a fact that they are thoroughbred race horses that make that prevalence on the slide there so high. It's not that they're thoroughbreds per se.
Yeah. Well, look, that's great, because I think people do tend to associate thoroughbreds with ulcers because they probably come out of training yards with ulcers, and then people think it's a thoroughbred problem, which is part of the title of this session tonight, that it's not because they're thoroughbreds, it's because they're in that that intense high carbohydrate environment, I guess.
Yeah, and breaking that cycle can be really hard. Breaking that cycle from I've been in the race track and I've had ulcers, or I've got ulcers as I come off racing, to I'm going to be a riding horse, is one of the biggest challenges of rehoming thoroughbred racehorses, re-establishing that hindgut as a valuable fuel source for them, moving them away from what I almost consider is like an addiction on high carbohydrate diets. It's a functional addiction, almost a behavioral addiction as well, moving them away from that to roughage-based diets, where we can then start addressing those factors that drive the risk of squamous disease. So it's not one or the other. It's complex, but if we can get them along that pathway, we can absolutely get them to a point where their risk is no different from any other horse.
Yeah. And do you have tips for how to do that? If you get a horse, so a lot of people will get a horse, it's run maybe, 10 days, 2 weeks ago, and then somebody has decided, right, this horse is not performing, or it's whatever, and somebody takes it. And so it's cold turkey almost. They go from one extreme to the other. So do you have tips, Sorcha or Ben, either of you have tips on how you make that transition? Because it probably is a bit of a shock for the horse if it goes from that high grain diet then into a leisure environment or a sport horse environment, or sometimes people give them a bit of a break, and so how do people go about making that change?
I remember Ben said in our last meeting about how
I just can't hear you there, Sorcha. You're coming and going a bit. Is your Wi-Fi giving you bother?
Oh, it must be. Can you hear me properly or no?
Yep.
Sorry, I remember speaking with you guys the last time, and Ben, you were speaking about how the thoroughbreds coming out of training have that functional addiction to starch because their microbiome is basically primed to digest it, whereas it should be digesting fiber. And the overload of starch is causing havoc, really. So we kind of have to retrain them how to forage and digest the fiber.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the missing link, in the sense that what happens with these horses is they come out, they're used to functionally and behaviorally used to high carbohydrate meals, even if they have roughage provided during training. So there's this perception that, oh, but the horse has got all the hay, it's got free choice hay, I've solved the problem. And the answer is no, because eating that hay is a behavior, and it's a learnt behavior, and they can unlearn it. And we see this in these horses. We see it with grass. We have horses that haven't seen grass necessarily for years, because they're coming back from, ours come back from Hong Kong. So they might not have seen green grass for years. And they stand in the paddock and look at it and go, what's this stuff? I don't understand what that's for. And so having the behavioral aspect where there's other horses around them grazing, and they go, oh, what's that horse doing? Maybe I can try that. Hey, this stuff tastes good. I'm going to do more of it. I mean, that sounds really simplistic, but it's true.
Yeah.
It's real.
Yeah.
It's backed by science. We know that horses cohabitating with other horses spend 40% time more grazing than horses by themselves. It's that simple. So it's that recognizing that behavioral implication, but it's also getting that hindgut functioning again. And we don't have a lot of good data about hindgut in these populations, but anecdotally, some of these horses, when you look at them at post-mortem, their hindguts are shredded. They have very severe pathology in the hindgut, structural pathology, not just functional pathology of the microbiota, but structural pathology of the gastrointestinal tract itself. That takes time to heal, and it takes time for the structural pathology to heal, and it takes time for the functional pathology to heal, and the normalization of hindgut function. I'm a big fan in 𝗧𝗵𝗁 𝗏𝗂𝗂𝗃 as a stabilizer and as a specific strains for that. But we have to recognize that is going to take time. But the problem is we need to break the cycle of being addicted to the need for the carbohydrate intake. And the first thing to do is get that carbohydrate intake down below 1 gram per kilogram per meal, because that's the level at which it bypasses the small intestine and ends up in the hindgut. So if we're thinking about the first stage of fixing the stomach is getting the hindgut functioning, it is get their carbohydrate down below a gram per kilogram per meal. So that might mean feeding 2 or 3 or 4 meals a day instead of 1 or 2 meals a day.
So that's half a kilo for your average thoroughbred. So you're talking about just one kind of small scoop then per meal, and they're used to getting considerably more than that in their.
That's half a kilo of carbohydrate. But if we have a 20% feed, it's 2.5 kilos of feed.
Oh, okay. So it's not feed, it's just of carbohydrate. Okay.
Yeah. And if we switch
that's a big shock for them to go from what they're getting to just a tiny bit. Okay. So about 2.5
And if we switch
kilos.
from a low carbohydrate, high fat feed, that's down in the carbohydrate at the 10% range, 10 to 12% range, we're now talking about up to 4 kilograms of feed. That's a lot.
Okay.
It takes a lot to exceed that, but it's regularly done in the racehorses racing environment. Once we re-establish that, we then want to focus on the behavioral aspects of increasing roughage to counter that. And what that means is we're potentially going to be feeding horses. We're going to be potentially feeding horses a different hay during that transition period than we would for their long-term management. It might be that we need to feed them more palatable hay. It might be that we need more lucerne alfalfa in their diet just because of palatability. We might need to sort of spoil them and nanny them a little bit to get them back onto the habit of eating and to get their consumption to shift from 1% to 2%. And there's a difficult period that they go through.
Kind of looking with the haylage.
Sorry, go ahead, Sasha.
The haylage in Ireland is quite good to play around with as well for those horses. Like, they absolutely love the smell of that. So we're in a very privileged position with the quality of the haylage here. So I think when you do have a horse like that, you do have to play around with it to get them to forage again. So it might be a case of trying out different haylages and different hays to see what fits.
And measure the intake. You've got to measure the intake, because you cannot assume because the horse has free choice hay that it's actually eating it. And that seems so obvious, but I learned that one at researching horses one day. Horses had hay nets in front of them, and I went ahead and scoped them, and they still had empty stomachs. I'm like, hey, what's going on here? This doesn't make sense. And the answer was the horses weren't eating the hay, and that there was nothing wrong with the hay. And a haylage is a great option because it's highly palatable. Horses love it. Interestingly, from my time in Finland, we almost never saw squamous disease in the sports horse population. And I personally attribute that to management, but also haylage. I think haylage is, but you've got to recognize that haylage has a lot more water in it. So instead of consuming 2%, it's closer to 4% of what they're going to voluntarily consume normally. But yeah, finding something that a horse actually wants to eat and measuring its intake to make sure it's appropriate. That's really going to be the cornerstone while we drop those carbs down and shift from that behavioral dependence and that functional dependence on their carbohydrate addiction.
Because that's an interesting comment about haylage, 𝗧𝗵𝗂𝘁, because I think sometimes people are a bit wary because, they worry that the horse, I know we chatted about this before when we were meeting up before this, that people worry that maybe horse is going to get a bit colicky and they're worried about switching from hay to haylage. But obviously it's more important just to get something they like and get them used to it and then work with that. So, maybe we sort of under-consider haylage for horses in Ireland a bit. And we do have great haylage, you're right, it comes scaled.
It's kind of a misconception about haylage that it's too rich and all of these things. I've heard that they have to cut back on the amount of haylage compared to hay, but actually the haylage is less sugar. It has a lot more fermentable fibers in it. So that's this lovely smell you're smelling. So that's they want to eat more of it because they actually need to eat more because there's a lot more water in it. So it, like Ben says, there'll be a lot more chewing, and that saliva will act as a natural buffer. So I wouldn't say stay away from haylage at all. I'd say just make sure your haylage is good quality, and then you're going to be able to have the same benefits of chewing and as well as getting more water into them.
Yeah, and the great thing with haylage is, when you buy it and it comes wrapped, like most of us, I suppose, with just a few horses will buy small bales wrapped, generally the quality is very good. Whereas, I've given up making hay now in Ireland, to be honest with you, because we put it in the shed and it would be lovely. And then you come back a few weeks later and it's all moldy, it's horrible. So it's very easy to store. I know if you have a lot of horses, then, you might be having large bales, but those small bales that you buy, they tend to be very high quality. They're easy to store, and when you open them, they generally are very good. So it's fairly repeatable and reliable, I guess, as a feed source. Whereas it's very difficult, even if you put in nice hay in Ireland, it's very difficult to keep it all through the season and not have it, heat or get moldy or musty or whatever with our environmental conditions. Just before we move on, a couple of people have asked Ben about the Saccharomyces that you mentioned as an additive. So could you just explain that and what it does? Or sorry, or both of you maybe, or what your thoughts are on that?
I'll give my very brief version, then I'll hand over to 𝗧𝗵𝗂𝘁, who's, I'm sure, much more experienced. I think of Saccharomyces cerevisiae as the great stabilizer. So we originally thought of it as being something that moderated the impact of high carbohydrate diets and reduced the degree of acidosis. That's what the original work was done on, and that's true. But the more and more data we have, the more and more data supports its role in the ability to ameliorate those changes in microbiota that occur, particularly with dietary change. So you talked about that idea of haylage. If I think about colic, it is disruption of hindgut fermentation that causes colic. There is a large number of drivers. I'm much more worried about a horse with a very unhealthy hindgut being at risk of colic than I am whether it's eating haylage or hay. And so I think of Saccharomyces as the great stabilizer and promoter of a nice, healthy, stable environment on which the microbiota can then function. And that's my level of sort of understanding of it. And I'll give it to 𝗧𝗵𝗂𝘁 now.
Okay, and so just one of the questions was, sorry, just before you start, was can dry brewer's yeast be used for it? So you might just address that as well. I don't know much about it, to be honest. So
yeah, so 𝗧𝗵𝗁 𝗃𝗃 is a probiotic, so it's a live yeast. So there's a lot of confusion about the different types of yeast on the market. So that wouldn't be the one that would be effective. You have to have the right concentration of the live probiotic to get the effects of that Ben's alluding to there to stabilize the microbiome. So you'll find that in our care range, the horse care range has that in it already. So once you're getting over 10 grams of 𝗧𝗵𝗁 𝗃𝗃 in the multiplied by 10 to the power 47, it's a specific formulation that we use, then you're getting the benefits. So there's loads of different yeasts on the market, and they'll have claims that they will be beneficial, but you really need to make sure it's the correct one. So that's where nutritionists come in to help you along the way.
Okay.
I think it's like buying a car. So, you know, they're all brewer's yeast technically. Like, I mean, that's the sort of the colloquial term for 𝗧𝗵𝗁 𝗃𝗃. 𝗃𝗃 is beer, right? It makes beer.
Yeah.
Fantastic stuff. But it's like buying a car. You can buy a Mini Minor, you can buy a Porsche, you can buy a pickup truck, you can buy a horse truck. They're not all the same thing. And they're not all going to do the same job. So you can't just grab one off the shelf and say, oh, look, I got a Mini Minor, I'm going to haul 6 horses with it. It doesn't work that way. So it has to be specific strains, and there's specific registered strains in the EU that are there because they're validated.
Okay. You can't go feeding your horse a couple of pints of beer, then that's not going to do the trick.
Well, we're getting into the Guinness discussion.
You have to use the correct thing.
You're opening a can of worms there, Andrea.
Or maybe just have one yourself while you're looking at your horse bringing out your saddle. Okay, so do you want to go back to the slides then, Sarika, and go through the, you know, I suppose the big thing is, you know, it's great that people understand what the horse is coming out of the racing with, or the ulcers, and then, you know, how to get about managing it.
Yeah, so I suppose now we know how ulcers are caused, that they're caused about their anatomy and how we're feeding them and basically the systems we have them in. So prevention then and how we can basically manage them is key. So there's kind of basic steps to follow, and a lot of people jump in straight away and want a supplement, or they want a different feed, or they basically just want to change something easy because that's how humans think. But I just want to change the way of thinking, like we already alluded to, the foraging behavior. And we need to just remember that forage always comes first. Basically, they want to feed it first in the morning. So even just a step of feeding the hay half an hour before offering the concentrate can make a huge difference. So always think forage first in my thoughts, and forage first in the manger, and forage first when I look at my horse, I want him foraging. So then what we say, we're going to measure how much he's eating. So how do you do that? You're basically checking how often you fill up your hay net and see that hay. If it's dry hay, it's probably over 85% dry matter. So you can make a good estimate when you weigh your hay net as to how much that is going to be in dry matter. The haylage is a bit more complicated because there's a bit of a different range in the dry matter. But the key that you're looking for is at least 1.5% of their body weight in dry matter per day. That's the absolute minimum. Ideally about 2%. And there's loads of studies out there that show if we don't feed our horses that amount of forage or fiber, they'll actually go and get it other places. So there was that study that showed horses to eat up to 3 kilos of shavings a day because they're used to feeling full. They're used to be feeling full of fiber. So they need to basically scratch that itch, and they need to go foraging and find that somewhere. So we need to prioritize that above everything else, above our expensive feeds, above our to think about that. And that fiber in their stomach is acting like a sponge. So it's actually soaking up that excess acid that the horse is constantly producing. So it's stopping that splash at the top of the stomach as well. So it has a lot of different functions. It's also going to slow down. He'll feel a lot fuller and everything gets absorbed a lot better. So That's really key. Forage first. Next, we move on to the concentrates, and we are going to select a lower starch alternative.
We're losing you again there, 𝗧𝗏. I don't know.
If you're thinking about where to start, so that's where the care range.
You're just going there on
that
the
we have.
on your
And
Wi-Fi.
our
Can you
lowest
hear me?
one is 𝗧𝗏 𝗥𝗏. It's only 4% starch, so that's a really good one to start with if of ulcers on your yard. But yes, so I won't go into complete detail on everything, but the next step, to just keep it simple then, would be the supplements. So that's where you're looking at extra things to add to their diet, like that 𝗧𝗏 𝗥𝗏 that we mentioned. There's also other proven benefits naturally in products like beet pulp. So you'll see that included in some of our formulations, but it's also really helpful to use as a mash too. And then antacids as well. So they can be quite beneficial to basically dampen down the acid in their stomach. So you want a long-acting rather than something like carbohydrate of the care range. So you don't really need to worry about all of that if you're feeding a complete diet on the care range already. Then the supplement world literally is like an absolute whirlwind if you go treating ulcers with supplements, as they're not medicines. And number two, how do ulcers cause in the first place? If you look at the back of the supplement and it tells you it's an antibacterial property, that's not how ulcers are caused. We've just learned that's not how they're caused.
𝗧𝗏, I don't know if you can hear me, but we're not really getting.
So you should not be buying that supplement.
Okay, we're not really getting you very well, but we have the slide.
I know Ben to say about the starch and things like that as well as the diet. I won't.
Okay, 𝗧𝗏, I don't know if you can hear us, but we can't really hear you, but we have all the information on the slide. So it's just your Wi-Fi seems to be cutting in and out. But I think what I got from it is that, you know, the forage first. I think it's nice to have that little thing in your head. It's like the 3 Fs with the friends, forage and the freedom. So, you know, that's a good way of thinking it, because I think a lot of people just throw in a bit of hard feed and think, well, I'll come back around and hay up later. So have you anything to add to that, Ben? You know, is that how you go about your feeding routine then when you're feeding your horses or switching them from racing into, you know, sport horse activities?
Yeah, I'd make a couple of comments there. I mean, I agree absolutely, and I think it's fascinating that we still think that forage first is somehow this novel idea. Like it blows my mind as someone who didn't grow up with horses that we have to tell people that horses eat hay or horses should eat roughage. I mean, it's just like, ooh, like really? That's so ingrained in the culture that and then rationalized and trivialized, and I think that's one thing. I think, again, those behavioral aspects, we talk, you know, horses outside eat 50% more than horses inside. And so even just if we have a horse confined, a walk in, walk out, you know, and what we'll see is a walk in, walk out, those horses will tend to spend more time outside because they like being outside. And if we give them, 𝗧𝗏 said, if you give them multiple roughage sites, they increase their amount of grazing behavior. They naturally mimic that normal grazing, walking around type behavior. The other thing that when I think about forage first is I think we need to press the reset button on the concept of what is good hay for horses. And so good hay for horses is not the richest, most nutritionally dense hay we can find. That might be a good hay for our off-the-truck thoroughbred that is re-establishing its eating behavior, that needs that small intestinal absorption of nutrient to maintain its caloric and nutrient intake. But it's not a great hay for a Connemara pony. It's not a great hay for an easy keeping warm blood that's potentially got or at risk of metabolic disease. So when we say forage first, the next question we have to ask ourselves is, what is a good hay for horses? And for me, a good hay for horses is a hay that is suitably hygienic and palatable, that a horse can eat as much as it wants of without restriction and without excessive weight gain. And that should be our target. We get into a loop where we say our hay's too good, we're going to restrict that horse. We're going to put it on slow feeders. We're going to do this. We have data that shows, there's a slide here, on this slide here, it says that head position, horses with their head down at ground level chew twice as much as the horses at shoulder height, and they eat more. We have data that shows that horses with hay nets consume, if we take free hay compared to hay net, horses with free hay on the ground consume 50% more, and that translates to a decreased risk in squamous disease. And so our goal should be, if we want to keep it really simple, as natural as possible, because every single bit of scientific data says the more back towards their natural environment you go, the benefit for gastric disease, unless you put them out in a paddock with no grass and say, well, it's on grass, but there's actually no grass in the paddock. That's a different issue. But really thinking about that in modern horse management, how can I normalize things back to their natural environment? And then the thing about supplements and treats and stuff, I think it's really important we don't diminish the value of those to the owner and the role they play in that emotional connection that the owner has with the horse. But I think what we want to do is not discount that behavior, but redirect that behavior to things that do have genuine positive benefit versus perceived positive benefit because of marketing. Because as 𝗚్য said, marketing supplements is the Wild West. Anyone can make any claim they want and no one holds them accountable. I think the Irish and the Australians share natural cynicism. Just call bullshit. If it looks like bullshit, it's bullshit, and just call it. But we can redirect that behavior to good things. We can redirect that behavior towards beet pulp. Beet pulp as an ingredient reduces the risk of squamous disease in horses as a standalone nutrient inclusion. We can look at treats. Okay, so what's a treat? Well, a treat for us is a carrot, but a treat for the horse is just as much lucerne alfalfa hay. And pre-exercise feeding with some hay and a scratch is just as valuable to that horse as a carrot, while still giving that owner that emotive reward. And that's where I think we want to channel these things rather than being an absolutist yes or no. It's channeling to what we have on the slide here about doing these things for the right reasons for everyone and the horse benefits.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because after our chat, I was just speaking earlier and said I bought a horse, for a Trowella horse, basically to go and get prepared for a second career. And when I brought him back, he was quite slow to eat the hay. And you had mentioned feeding the hay off the ground. So I was feeding it off the ground. Now I got a few comments of, why you're doing that. You're messing the stable up. It's much tidier, so I think we do a lot of things to facilitate ourselves, don't we? So we put the hay in the hay racks, because it's tidy, it conserves the hay, the horses aren't walking on it. And a lot of our feeding routines, and a bit like that, throwing in the hard feed and coming back and haying up later, all of those things we tend to do to facilitate our time. I think we do, rather than thinking about what's suitable for the horse. And, to me, instinctively, it seems, tidier and nicer for the horse to put its hay up in a rack. But actually, I hadn't really thought about the fact that the horse prefers to eat at a natural position, that they don't go around eating off the trees, that you're eating the grass.
I'm yet to meet a horse that cares about tidy. I'm yet to meet a horse that cares that they have a clean rug, that cares that they, I've got a great video of our off the trackers just rolling in mud, just having a ball. They're just living their best life covered in mud. And, the riders just sit there and go, oh, we've got to watch these horses. But we've got to shift our perspective. If we want to talk truly about horse welfare, we've got to shift our perspective from looking at it solely through our eyes and what we want to what the horse's perspective of this is. And then we've got to try and find a bridge. It can't be one or the other, because, it has to be practical. Our time is valuable too. But there are plenty of tools that can achieve both. And maybe we won't get all the way over here to say that this is exactly what the horse would want in an ideal world, but if we can get 80% of the way, we have a massive improvement in net horse welfare, maybe with only a little bit of 20% give on our way. The first thing we've got to do is just be willing to have a really hard conversation with ourselves as what I've been taught, what I've done for 20, 30, 50 years might not be best practice today. Doesn't mean we're wrong, doesn't mean we're bad people. It just means we live, we learn, we adapt over time. And there has been a massive shift in that landscape of our understanding in the last 5 years that I look back at my first 20 years as a vet and go, there's a lot of stuff I wouldn't do given my time again.
Yeah. I'm the same. I'm qualified even a bit longer than you are at it. And I look back at some of the things I used to do. And I attended a course about pain management a few years ago and started to learn about the pain face, which, again, wasn't even something I'd considered. And once you start to recognize it and see the expressions of pain in horses, it becomes more obvious. So I suppose it's just that education piece for us all to, as you say, maybe horses communicate to us more than we think they do. And we just, I suppose, get so focused on what we're trying to achieve that we...
Yeah, I think ulcers can be used as a good proxy for...
Yes. So they have that painful look, I think.
I think ulcers are a good proxy for well.
Yeah, I think ulcers have become a very convenient excuse. Oh, the horse is doing that because it's got ulcers. But I think when we look at ulcers, if we get back, I think the horse's stomach is a great window into the horse's well-being. And because it's very, very hard to get good gastric health without good well-being, without that horse's not just physical needs, but social and emotional needs being met. And so I use that stomach. When we go to the 3 Fs, the friends, the forage, the freedoms, I use the stomach as a proxy for what's this horse's life like, particularly glandular disease. And when I see glandular disease and squamous disease, the first question is about what's the environment of the horse? How does it relate to the 3 Fs? And I consider that presence of disease, instead of being something that I want to just treat, I consider it as a signpost for me to take a step back at that horse, look at that horse at an individual level and say, what are the things in its environment I can potentially improve to address why the disease is there, not just, oh, I've got to give it some drugs and make the disease go away. And the 3 Fs, the friend, forage, freedom, are always going to be the cornerstone of where we start that conversation.
So before we just nicely segue on to treatment, just as 1 or 2 comments just about the hay on the ground. As I say, I used to always feed it up on the racks, but I am starting to change my ways. Is there an issue for respiratory health or just contamination with having it on the ground versus having it in a rack? Or, I mean, do you think there's a counter argument for that, for the hay?
I would go on the ground every day of the week for respiratory health. Head down, natural drainage of the airway, enhanced mucociliary beats. The little cells in the airway pump the mucus out. They double that speed when the head is down. So it's almost like the horse evolved to eat off the ground. Yeah,
I suppose if we do our bit with our stable management and don't ask the horse to live in too much in its own toilet, then I suppose it should be perfectly feasible to feed the hay on the ground, because we're keeping that stable environment and picking it out regularly for them, I suppose. But again, I think that's an issue around timing and management and that, and I suppose that's become one of the issues with horses. There's probably more horses sometimes than people to mind them in yards. So just moving on to treatment. Sorry.
That's more, and that's a reality that we have to address. And the answer is less walls.
Yeah.
Tear down the wall. That's the answer. And tearing down the walls, less walls, improved ventilation, improved air movement, respiratory benefits. Tearing down walls, going to half stall designs or 3/4 stall designs where horses can reach across and groom their stablemate next door to them. Massive benefits in welfare, massive potential benefits in gastric health because of the behavioral implications of those things and disease. And we have not changed our number of horses on the yard, reduced our profitability. We have not had to we haven't banned a stable in the middle of a city like Dublin because you don't have turnout. But what we have done is found a bridge to address concerns rather than just digging in saying, but it works because I've done it like this for a long time.
Yeah.
That
Yeah,
openness in bridges that I think is really important.
That's a really good point. I think a lot of our trainers now are looking at having, these little small turnouts at the back of stables, and the horses can go back into those and communicate with the horse next door. And, I think they're hugely beneficial and taking, bits out of walls and stuff, and, allowing the horses to communicate. So I think we're definitely more aware of that. But just to get on to treatment then, it's obviously it's great to prevent the ulcers, but when you do have a horse that has persistent ulcers, what do you recommend treatment-wise then, or what are your thoughts on that? Are we all still giving them PPIs and that, or have you alternative suggestions?
The first thing about treatment is treatment should be a circuit breaker. And when we're treating it should be designed as a circuit breaker to press a reset and then turn around and go, what happens after treatment? We should be asking what happens after treatment when we start treatment. Now, for a racehorse, that might be, we recognize there are inherent factors in that horse's lifestyle that are going to maintain a risk of disease. And it might be that we're going to treat and move into prevention with omeprazole. For a riding horse, we should be able to manage riding horses without pharmacology. We should be able to manage them without drugs in the long run. We might need to use them specifically and targeted, but our treating is designed to break that cycle. Squamous disease is very much still founded around acid suppression, and omeprazole is our cornerstone for that. When we give omeprazole, we want to give it, we know that food impairs omeprazole absorption. We don't need to give it on an empty stomach. We probably shot ourselves in the foot when we use that word at some point, but we want to give it when the stomach is naturally at its emptiest, to reduce the impact of food. And that's going to be very first thing in the morning. And I mean like 6 o'clock, before 6 o'clock, because by 8 o'clock, they've woken up and started eating and had enough to reduce drug absorption by 2 to 3-fold. We then need to allow that drug to get absorbed and then feed the horse 30 minutes later or so. And that feeding is important because it actually activates the omeprazole. The drug actually needs to be turned on. If we're talking about glandular disease, we're typically going to add in sulforaphane to that. And we know that improves treatment outcomes. And then we're going to add that into that initial treatment window. And then the feeding 30 minutes later is still the same. We are moving away from necessarily separating the omeprazole and sulforaphane so religiously. But it's really a sort of an individual case by case, whether we separate it or not.
So you're giving the omeprazole first and then the sulforaphane later and then the feed later again. Is that how you're doing it?
Yeah. So
or you're giving the sulforaphane later in the day?
The current standard recommendation would be to give the omeprazole, wait 25, 30 minutes, give the sulforaphane, and then feed straight away after that. I don't think we don't need to, after giving the sulforaphane, we don't need to wait another 30 minutes. Okay. Sulfophane's not getting absorbed. It's getting there and physically coating the stomach, and that happens within a few minutes. And so we don't have to go 0, 30, 30. We can go 0, 25, 30, and shorten that window up. We are probably moving away from separating omeprazole sulforaphane. We are redoing the consensus statement this year as we speak. And that'll definitely be a hot topic of conversation, whether we even actually need to separate them at all or whether they can just be given concurrently, because that's the direction that human medicine's moved back towards.
Right. Okay. Well, it's certainly encouragement to people to try and prevent their squamous ulcers so they don't have to get up at 6 a.m. to give the horse the meds before they feed them an hour later. So it's definitely a good cause. And in terms of any new treatments or anything different, are they still the gold standard treatments? And how long do you recommend treating for? What's your routine there?
Yeah, there are other treatments that are used. 𝗵𝟏 is one that's used. It's a drug that's not without its challenges. And I think especially when we get to glandular disease, it's always going to be, there's no silver bullet. There's no one drug that fixes everything. That's where that relationship with the veterinarian is so critical, and being willing to be patient and work through the nuances of each individual case. And so, that can be drug selection, that can be duration. We don't really have a fixed duration for glandular disease. That's going to be that conversation with the veterinarian and that individual case by case discussion. What I will say is that sort of as a new nugget of information is that we do have data coming out of the UK that shows that just treating the ulcers doesn't necessarily resolve the problem. What a shock. But actually that horses with concurrent musculoskeletal lameness or back issues are less likely to respond to pharmacological therapy. So if they've got a sore back or a lameness that's concurrent to the gastric disease, the glandular gastric disease, they're actually less likely to respond to drugs. And so we can't just, this idea that we just see a horse, we scope its stomach and say that's the cause of its all ills and we're going to give it some drugs and fix the problem, has to go out the window. We have to look at these horses more holistically, from not just addressing the ulcers, but why are the ulcers there? And also, why is the behavior there? Because the behavior can be driven by multiple factors like back pain and gastric disease. And maybe we need to treat two things at once. And the higher the performance level of the horse, the more likely is it's going to have multiple physical health issues that need to be managed, not just a target on, I'm going to scope its stomach, I can see something. That is what I'm going to focus all of my time and energy on, and money.
Gosh, the stomach really is the window to the life of the horse then, isn't it? You know, so obviously is it that kind of continuous pain is just continuously triggering, you know, what's causing the ulcers. So no matter how much you treat it, those triggers are just still there all the time.
Yeah, and you can spend an awful lot of money and not solve the problem. And the question is, what's the problem? Is the problem how the stomach looks, or is the problem how the horse feels? And that goes back to make sure we understand what's actually driving that behavior. And that conversation we had earlier around the presentation of girthiness or whatever. What I will do, although I'm not so clinically active these days, but what I will do is if someone brings a horse to me for gastroscopy and its primary presentation is behavioral, undesirable behavior, either on ground or during riding, the first thing I will do is a lameness exam.
Okay.
Despite the fact that I'm a gastric ulcer person. And the reason for that is there is a huge body of evidence that Sue Dyson has put together demonstrating the relationship between this undesirable behavior, both ridden and on ground, and the presence of musculoskeletal pain. And it is so common. 70+% of our weekend warrior horses are not sound. I won't call them lame, but I'll say they're not sound. So we have to start there. And then I'll look at their stomach, and then I'll look in their mouth. And I'm one of these people who's not I don't particularly like dentistry. Some people love dentistry. I don't. But we have to look in their mouth. And there is more and more data coming out showing that oral lesions, whether it be teeth or whether it be common Schur lesions, these types of things cause these types of behaviors that are reported within the ridden horse pain ethogram. And if we take our time and look at a horse, instead of just scoping its stomach in 20 minutes, we do a basic lameness and look at its mouth. We're now at 40 minutes. We have 10 times as much information to work with to solve the actual problem that the owner brought the horse for, which was pain-based behavior.
Yeah, well, I'm hogging all the questions here now, but I have two questions coming into my head out of that. So one is, it sounds like the stomach is more of a symptom really than a problem in itself, you know, that it's, you know, probably a symptom of all the other problems the horses might be experiencing. And the other thing that I've often wondered when I've scoped stomachs, you know, you have to fast them for quite a long time to do it. Does that make life harder for the horse that has stomach problems, the whole experience of having to be fasted for a gastroscope? Or, you know, what's your view on that? So, you know, I sometimes wonder, do we kind of put horses through a little bit of a hard time scoping them when they already have bad stomachs, or do you think that has any impact on them?
Yeah, so the first question, the stomach is an outcome of these other things that are going on in the horse's life. It doesn't mean that we don't need to treat the stomach. It doesn't mean we don't need to manage that outcome, but it means that we need to take a step back from just doing that to asking much bigger questions. And we've always said, oh, it's got ulcers, go and look at how much grain it's eating, how much hay it's being fed being the key word, not eating. But we're expanding that to say we have to go back and look at the rest of the horse in terms of being pain-based sources and the rest of the horse's environment, the friends, the forage, the feed. So we've always said, look for a cause. We've just really expanded that into a much broader context of holistically evaluating the horse and its environment. The question around gastroscopy, my short answer is no. I don't worry about that as a trigger or exacerbating the clinical signs. You never get a short answer from me, so I'll give you a long answer too. We know that fasting a horse or starving a horse for 16 hours does not cause ulcers. It takes about 48 hours of cumulative starvation to cause squamous disease. They actually don't have an empty stomach until the very end of that process. It takes that 16 hours for the stomach to empty completely. Are there behavioral implications of that? Is there a welfare imposition of taking a horse off food for that period of time? 100%. And we need to recognize that. And sometimes we need to manage that. But it's a net positive benefit that we're looking for. The critical thing is that when we take that step back and we say, we recognize these behavioral presentations are a presentation of pain, before we spend a lot of time, effort, and money treating the horse, we need to know we are actually treating something that exists. And that is the presence or absence of gastric disease. It's not just about money. It's about the horse's welfare. Because if we go off down that path and we have something else driving the issue that we haven't recognized because we haven't evaluated the horse properly or completely, we're compromising that horse's welfare because we didn't look or we didn't have the right diagnosis. And so gastroscopy tells us whether gastric disease is part of the problem or not. All of the evidence, all of the studies show that there is no correlation between any clinical sign and gastric disease, any specific clinical sign and gastric disease. And all of the evidence says that even the most astute owner cannot tell you whether a horse has ulcers or not. Maybe over time it becomes learnt for an individual horse, but as a first up, trainers in racehorse stables can't say who's got ulcers, riding horse owners can't say who's got ulcers, dressage riders can't say who's got ulcers and not. There is a real disconnect. It then tells us about squamous and glandular, which has treatment implications, but also has long-term management implications for how we set this horse up for success after treatment. And then also, I think it tells us when we do have squamous disease, the particular pattern of disease can be useful, giving us insights into why that squamous disease is there in terms of the roughage ball, acid splash, and these types of things. So is it an imposition? Absolutely. Is it an imposition that generates a net welfare positive for the horse? 100%. Is it an imposition that generates a net positive for the owner-horse relationship moving forward to achieve the goal of a healthy, happy horse and a healthy, or not a healthy owner, but a happy owner? Yep. And so, I'm still very pro-gastroscopy. Yeah. I think it actually adds more value now than it did 5 years ago before we recognized this pain conversation and this mimicking see across disease. I think it's far more relevant now than it was before we realized that lameness causes all of the same symptoms in a horse that gastric disease does.
Yeah, that's great to know, because I find sometimes people can be a bit reluctant to, present their horses for scoping. So, it's good to be able to reassure people that there really is no, it doesn't exacerbate it, or there is no long-term issue in doing the exam. So, and it's obviously still the gold standard for figuring out what's going on in the stomach anyway.
And I think it's important that we acknowledge the owner's concerns. We acknowledge the owner has recognized that there's a welfare implication to this. I don't want to do it because it'll have a deleterious welfare impact on my horse. We shouldn't discount that. But what we're looking for is a net welfare benefit. It's not just about saving money by unnecessary treatment. It's about having the right diagnosis so as soon as possible, we can start improving that horse's overall welfare.
Okay. I don't know what your Wi-Fi is like, Sorcha, whether you want to join in or not. I suppose one other thing I wanted to touch on was about going out to competitions and whether what you should feed a horse before. So if you go to an event or go to a show jumping competition, should you feed your horse how soon before they go out and compete, or, when you should do and what you should do. So I don't know whether you're happy to answer that, Sorcha, or what your Wi-Fi is like now.
So I just missed the start of it there.
Sorry, I was
asking about how soon you should.
Yeah, whether you should feed before exercise. So I know you know, back in the day, it was always you should work a horse on an empty stomach, or you should race a horse on an empty stomach, or, you know, you shouldn't feed them too soon before competing. And I think we've kind of moved on from that now. And we recognise that that's not very comfortable for the horse. It causes all that splash. So I'm just wondering what you both recommend, you know, for horses that are out competing before they go out on their cross-country round or their show jumping or their race or whatever they're doing, you know, when they should be fed and how much they should be fed.
Yeah, so I would advise fibre first. So if you're feeding a meal before riding, ideally do that 2 hours before you're going to do that race or that competition, but make sure you have the fibre in there half an hour before that meal. So that'll slow down the whole digestive process, and it'll also have that fibre mat effect to stop the splash in the stomach. So you're never advised to exercise on an empty stomach. You always want to have fibre in there first. And if you do want to have a meal in there as well, they'll just have to time it so it's between 1 and 2 hours beforehand, as well as the fibre on top.
And how big would that meal be? Would it just be a small amount, or what would you advise then? You know, let's say in a competitive situation, so you're going away for the day and you're going to be, let's say you do your dressage and then you're going to go cross country. And so, you know, would you give just a small amount, or would you just give them hay all day in the horse box in that situation, or what way would you work that?
Yeah, so definitely ad lib hay access as you can. And then say if you're doing, I don't know, a 3-day event or something like that, obviously the bigger meal won't be the one before your exercise. But if you do feed them 3 times a day, try keep to that schedule. And that meal you're feeding is going to be smaller than a 2 kilo amount. Obviously, it'll depend on the amount of starch in that meal. Below those parameters we advise. So less than 2 grams per kilo in each meal as well. And if it can be a fibre-based meal, it'll be a lot easier for the horses as well.
Okay, great. And what about you, Ben? What's your routine then? You go off and do a bit of show jumping out there in Australia. What's your routine before you head out?
I think the first thing is there's a lot of focus, and it's makes sense, but there's a lot of focus on what happens on the day of competition. So, you know, I think of it as the magic 8. It's the 8 hours a week you actually get to go and do something with your horse, and, you know, all that flat work you've put in and riding in circles actually means something when the horse competes. Some people love doing flat work. I'm not one of them. But the reality is that the ulcers don't occur on the drive to the horse show. They are there or not there the day you leave. And so it's really focusing, set the horse up for success and focusing on what the lead up is. The reason why it's so important to show is because that's when we interact with the horses the most. And it's also when the horse is under the most behavioral stress, therefore the most likely to be expressive. What it may have tolerated at home, its now behavioral threshold is reduced, and it's actually going to say, I don't like this anymore. I'm not happy. With regards specifically to feeding, that's a misappropriation of the old human. Your mum used to say, don't eat 30 minutes before a swim because you'll get a stitch. A stitch is effectively your spleen contracting to release red blood cells because you need them. That's what horses do when they exercise. They keep about 1/3 of their circulating red cell capacity in their spleen. They can shift, a racehorse can shift its hematocrit from 30 to 60 during high intensity exercise because its spleen contracts and releases those red cells. That's part of the reason they are such phenomenal athletes. That is physiologically normal for a horse. So it's a mistranslation of what happens to us to what happens to them. The reverse is, when we think about squamous disease is acid splashing up onto the squamous mucosa. If we get together, we have a few Guinnesses over a few nights, we're all going to get heartburn. At least if you're over the age of 50, you're going to get heartburn. Heartburn is acid splashing onto your squamous mucosa. You don't have an ulcer. You haven't had time to develop one, but you got a lot of pain. If you run a horse on an empty stomach and you're splashing acid up onto that squamous mucosa, it's going to hurt. You're going to cause heartburn in that horse, and that is going to impair performance. That is the complete reverse of what you're trying to achieve. It's not just going to have welfare and behavioral impacts on the horse. It is going to slow the horse down in a race. It is going to slow the horse down on cross-country course, make it harder for it to get around its 1-star, 2-star course, its 60-centimeter course. So yeah, we need to feed beforehand, and it doesn't take a huge amount. It's we don't know the exact amount, but half a kilogram to a kilogram makes a difference to the amount of acid, to the acid load in the stomach. I prefer hay because it forms that structural ball, but it makes a difference to the amount of acid that's in the stomach because we get that bicarbonate production and we get that buffering. So it doesn't have to be a huge amount. But our horses, our competition horses, when stabled, have hay in front of them at all times prior to competition. If we had particular concerns, we would maybe top that up with alfalfa, lucerne hay. Ours tend to eat their base hay pretty well, so we don't worry too much, but we do monitor it closely.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, I never knew horses got a stitch, or I never knew what caused human stitches. So I have a question in here. Actually, it's not to do with adult horses, but obviously you're an expert in this area, so we're going to tap you for all the information we can while you have you here, Ben. But there's a question on omeprazole for foals, and what age we should be considering whether it's okay to use omeprazole and whether it's good for foals, good for ulcers and foals. Just what your thoughts are about. I know this is a little segue here, but I'll say the opportunity to get that information off you, we can't waste it. So what are your thoughts on foals?
As much as necessary, as little as possible. And so I do not use routine prophylaxis of omeprazole in foals. I do not use routine prophylaxis of omeprazole in foals in hospital, with the exception of foals in sort of 2 to 6 months of age with gastrointestinal disease. And I will put those foals on prophylaxis with omeprazole sucralfate because those foals, that particular group, is at relatively high risk of gastroduodenal ulcerative disease and pyloric stenosis. So if I have a sick foal with diarrhea in the isolation at 2, 3, 4, 5 months of age, I'm going to put it on omeprazole sucralfate. I'm actually going to put it on intravenous omeprazole or esomeprazole because I don't trust that the oral is going to be absorbed. So very specific scenario. Okay. Outside of that, neonatal foals, absolutely not. Absolutely do not put them on routine prophylaxis. But if they show clinical signs of ulcers, absolutely I will treat them for gastric disease. But we shouldn't just be throwing drugs at them. It's the same as horses that are stabled for surgery. We shouldn't put every horse that comes in for surgery on omeprazole because it might get ulcers. We shouldn't put every horse on non-steroidals on omeprazole because it might get ulcers. We should recognize those as risk factors. We should monitor those horses and we should intervene when necessary, but we shouldn't just be blindly giving drugs because we think it's going to solve all the ills of the world. Potentially creates ills, maybe doesn't create ills, we don't know. But I think it's just a good philosophy. As an internal medicine person, as someone who's done a lot of intensive care and critical care, I'm still very much a minimalist. I try to do as little as possible, especially as few drugs as possible into that animal, because I want to focus on the big picture, not individual solutions.
And when you are, let's say if you were in that situation where you do end up treating a younger foal before the 2-month stage, would you always use the sucralfate with the omeprazole to protect the duodenum, or would you tend to just use the omeprazole on its own in a younger foal? If you are
the first couple of months of age, it's in hospital because it's had a slow start to life, and then sort of 2 or 3, 5 days in starts showing some abnormal nursing behavior. I'm just going to use the omeprazole. I don't necessarily go straight to the sucralfate as well. Again, it's just sort of trying to keep it as simple as possible. You get very rapid, almost immediate, but very rapid symptomatic relief in those foals, and you're on the right track and you've solved the problem, and then they come out of it just fine. It's that cohort that have complex gastrointestinal disease that is different. And to some of that depends how prevalent gastroduodenal ulcerative disease would be in your population. There's some populations where it seems to be really common, like Kentucky. They seem to get a lot of it. Other populations, it's relatively rare, so I'd be less concerned.
Well, we're going down a rabbit hole now for foals. But anyway, just last question on this. Somebody's asked, are the clinical signs for ulcers reliable in foals? You know, when they start drinking water and grinding and all that kind of stuff, are they generally fairly well coordinated with the actual level of ulcers, or has that been looked at, or what are your
It hasn't been looked at, so I don't think, well, not that I can recall, that I don't think we've got any data on that, but I think the answer is yes. I think the other part of it is if it is the problem, you do see a very rapid response to treatment. Those foals will improve within 12 hours of the first dose. And if they don't improve, you need to go looking for something else. So the 3-4 day old foal that starts grumbling, you go, oh, maybe it's ulcers, I'll give it some omeprazole, and it's still grumbling 6 hours later, something else is going on. It's maybe about to get diarrhea. It's maybe there's something else happening in that foal. It's where we use response to treatment as being a really important indicator. And back to the diagnosis question, I will do that in racehorses. So I will test treat in racehorses because it looks like a duck, it walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck. It's probably a duck. So if I've got a racehorse or an endurance horse that's losing its appetite, I don't necessarily gastroscope those horses. I know the risk factors are there. I know what's driving the disease potentially. And I will treat those horses and look for a positive response. But I expect to see a response within 3 to 7 days. And if I haven't, I'm going to go back and look for other reasons for inappetence, assuming the horse is systemically normal, like it doesn't have a fever or something like that. It does. Yeah. You don't reach the drug first. Do a clinical exam. If the horse is normal, then do it. Don't just go, oh, the horse is like, we've all done it. Don't worry, I've done it. Oh, it's lost its appetite, give it some omeprazole, and then 2 days later it blows with diarrhea, and you're like, whoops, we probably should have taken its temperature.
There's another question after coming in here. I know you said you're not a dentist, but anyway, just asking about teeth issues. You know, if they're, very problematic teeth and sore inside of the cheeks, and maybe horses are having difficulty and can't form a food bolus. Do you think that tends to cause squamous ulcers, because of inappetence from teeth problems? Has there been any research into that, or is that more of just an issue when there's a bit in their mouth?
It's again a separation between evidence and experience. There's not a lot of strong evidence to support dental disease as a cause of gastric disease, but it hasn't been super well evaluated. I think certainly it makes sense where we have dental disease that reduces roughage consumption. It's a clear possibility that's going to flow on until a risk of squamous disease if it's sustained. We also recognize that dental disease mimics those clinical signs of pain-based behavior. So it's at both levels. Dental disease is not unimportant. There's no doubt there that, and it's not just dental disease, it's oral disease. What we're recognizing coming out of Scandinavia, they've got a real bee in their bonnet about this in a good way, is just showing even relatively small oral lesions, little 𝗏𝗄𝗏 lesions and these types of things, increase aversive behavior during dressage is usually the easiest one to score because it's standardized. It's associated with even just relatively small lesions, which if you have a small ulcer in your mouth, how painful that can be. What a shock that a horse is going to react to a bit in its mouth with an oral lesion. So a real shift in understanding. So looking inside the horse's mouth at its teeth and at its soft tissues is absolutely critical for any horse with pain-based behavior. And then there can be flow down effects as well. So yes, but every time we go back to a higher level, it reinstates the importance of looking at more than just, and I would say the same thing for the people with dentistry. Don't just look at the teeth. It might be what you do really well, but be willing to consider that when it's behavior, it can be these other things as well.
You make an excellent point, Ben. I think we forget that horses experience pain, probably fairly similarly to how we do in a totally different world. I used to bang a lot of oxytocin into a lot of mares until I had an oxytocin induction on my first baby, and gave me a lot of respect for the drug. And I definitely was more sympathetic afterwards. So, it's a good point. If we had a mouth ulcer or a cut on our lip, I'm sure we wouldn't like to have a bit in our mouth. So we're nearly up to the time.
That's working. Like that used to be you gave the oxytocin, the horse is standing standing there in a ball that's sweating. It's
Yeah.
working.
It does work. It is painful.
I mean, it might
So
be
I think
to get rid of the retained fetal membranes. It might be a justifiable intervention like your oxytocin for birth, but we do need to recognise that.
Thankfully, they don't give it in humans the way they give it in horses. They don't bang in 2 mils all at once. But I think we're trying to get our last bit out of you. So I think we have time for one last question. And thank you so much, because it's fantastic to have someone who literally there's been no question we've asked you that you haven't known. But obviously, that's why we have the expert, the world expert here on gastric ulcers tonight. But there's one question about chaff and alfalfa. I suppose we don't tend to feed it all that much in Ireland, you know, the way, obviously, I don't know what the Australian hay is like, but let's say the way the Americans would have their alfalfa hay. But we do buy, or sometimes we have bagged chaff and alfalfa. So the question is it still important to include with hard feeds or prior to riding if the horse is eating an appropriate amount of forage during the day? Oh, it's come up there. You know, or is that buffer still important? Or, you know, if the forage level is okay, do we need it? Is basically the question, I think.
It's a fantastic question. I think the first question we want to ask ourselves, so the forage intake, fantastic question, because it's framing our thinking around how much forage is that horse eating? The next question is, when is that horse eating forage? And we know that they consume 70-80% of their roughage during daylight hours and a relatively small amount overnight. They shut down about 10 o'clock at night, tend not to eat so much through till about 6 o'clock the next morning. That's not every horse, but that's sort of the general cycle that they follow. So timing of exercise is important. So to answer this question, it depends. If you're exercising first thing in the morning, that hay net that's in front of the horse or the hay that's on the ground, it might not have eaten it yet. It might not have touched it. It might still have an empty stomach. And topping up that with something, it doesn't have to be alfalfa, something that is highly palatable that the horse will eat and restore its normal protective mechanisms pre-exercise is critical to reducing the risk of squamous disease. And that is the thoroughbred racehorse. The challenge with the thoroughbred racehorse is actually getting it to eat something before exercise, because they're so excited that the world's about to turn on for the day. If you go to the other end and you've come home from work and your horse has been out in the field, and we do have evidence that says that being out in the field doesn't necessarily protect against gastric disease. And so if they're out on grass, I would still add roughage, hay-based roughage or haylage to their pre-exercise thing, because if we think about grass, sometimes it's about the availabilities. Not every horse that's out on pasture actually has access to 50, 60 kilograms a day of grass they need to eat to maintain their roughage intake. It's a lot. And you actually look at how horses are kept, and they're often on grass that's this long. It's like, how are they eating that much grass? They're not. The other is whether grass forms a roughage ball or whether it forms soup. And so I would still take those horses and I would reinforce those horses pre-exercise with hay. It doesn't have to be alfalfa. It could just be haylage that they like, and they're going to top up their stomach with half a kilo of hay. The horse let's take another example where the horse is stabled on hay all day, probably not so much. But again, that horse is going to have less hay intake than it probably should, because it's been, so yes. So it just keeps looping back to whichever scenario you look at, there really remains potential, if not clear benefit, to pre-exercise feeding of some roughage-based source. It doesn't have to be alfalfa, but some roughage-based source, for all of these reasons why we might have suboptimal defense mechanisms. The last is horses really like it. And that's a very positive way of reshaping any pain-based behavior. And it's a really nice way of reinforcing the horse owner bond. So instead of the horse being caught and going, I'm going to be ridden, I don't really want to do that today. It's like, hey, giddy up. Someone's going to give me something yummy to eat. Oh yeah, I'll have to do it right afterwards. That's fine. I'll get that done. And so it's a very long way of saying, yes, I would build that in as a fundamental wherever possible.
Do you know what, Ben? We could listen to you all night, but the time is actually up. It's 9:30. That was a fantastic answer. And I'm starting to look at everything I've done, thinking, you know, God, I've often got my feeding quite wrong, but I've learned so much tonight. We're finishing off on this very last slide. 𝗧𝗵 has asked me to put this in. I'm doing all the talking for her tonight as well as myself, but because of the Wi-Fi situation. But these are all the myths. I think we've probably maybe come across a few others as well. So I think you both agree with these, and I'm going to give the last word to Ben on this afterwards. So racehorses do not get ulcers because they're thoroughbreds. High protein feed does not cause ulcers. Supplements cannot cure ulcers. Alfalfa does not cause ulcers. Horses fed haylage do not need to eat less than those fed hay. We used to always think it was fattening and you shouldn't feed too much of it. And ulcer severity grade does not determine pain level, and ulcers do not have definitive clinical symptoms or signs, and so therefore gastroscopy is the gold standard to diagnose them. Have I got all that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with all of those, and I would finalize by saying we think of ulcers as that window into that horse's welfare and environment, and when we see ulcers, we need to deal with them, but we need to step back, look at the whole horse, and we need to step back and look at the whole horse's environment, founded on the 3 Fs, which we didn't get into too much today, but it's just so fundamental.
Yeah, well, thankfully the 3 Fs are our concept that actually isn't so novel anymore. I think it is out there, and I think everybody probably does know what the 3 Fs are: the friends, forage, and freedom. So look, it's been absolutely fantastic. The time has flown by. We could still keep pumping you for questions for another hour, but that would probably be unfair. We need to let you get on with your day. Thank you so much to everybody for attending tonight. This webinar was recorded, so it will be up on our website on the education page. Thank you to 𝗧𝗵. Sorry we didn't get to hear as much from you as we would have liked to, 𝗧𝗵, but your Wi-Fi wasn't playing ball. And thank you so much to Ben and any vets who haven't put their name. You don't. I think we have the registration numbers, but if you just put your name, we'll make sure to get you the points. And I'm going to keep it open for a few minutes for people to do that. So thank you, and we're back in May. And our topic is oxidative stress. Actually, I think the 20th of May is our next date, but I'll let everyone know about that closer to the time.